Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Life with Shenita. I am Shenita Connolly, your host for this show, and I am delighted that you will join me live or in a replay. I'm excited about tonight's conversation on genetic testing, but before we get into that, I just want to share a couple of things. I would like for you all to please like and share this broadcast because I think the information is so important that not only you should benefit from it, but those that you know, and even those that you don't know. So please like and share the broadcast. As always, Life with Shanita was started to help people, all people, overcome life's challenges and to encourage them to live a vibrant life. And so we want to continue to do that in various ways, whether we're educating them, we're entertaining them, we are elevating them, or what have you. So tonight, I am excited to have a licensed and certified genetic counselor whom I've had the privilege of working with, who will share some very valuable information. And I just want to set the tone a little bit, as always. The risk of developing certain diseases, as well as screenings and sometimes medical treatment. Different types of genetic testings are done for different reasons. And so genetic testing, and I'm sure Julie will share that it looks for changes, sometimes called mutations and or variants in your DNA. Genetic testing is useful in many areas, as I said, of medicine and can change the medical care you and your family members receive. The reason that I kind of happen onto this genetic testing for myself is because I have two sisters with breast cancer, one on my dad's side of the family, one on my mom's side of the family. And so I thought it would be helpful for me to kind of know my risk factors. So, with that being said, I am going to introduce our special guest for this evening. Let's talk about the 411 of genetic testing with Miss Julie Howell. And so, with that being said, I am going to say good evening, Julie, and allow you to introduce yourself to our guests. So, welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shenita, for having me. My
Yes.
name is Julie Howell. Just like Shenita said, I'm a genetic counselor, and I've been a genetic counselor for several years. I am not originally from Georgia, but happy to call it my home now. And I am really excited to be able to talk to you folks about, why I think genetics is interesting, but also really important in lots of different ways during a person's life. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So, Julie, so I kind of shared a little bit about the good, the ugly of genetic
Yeah.
testing, a little bit about it. So before we dive deep into it, let's kind of talk about you a little bit. What's your favorite color? And tell us more about the woman, Julie Howell. Where are you from? What college did you attend? Just
Yeah.
some good stuff about you.
Well, thanks. I always appreciate, understanding me as a person along with the profession.
Yes.
So my favorite color is blue, specifically aqua. I like bright colors. Um, from who I am, like I mentioned, I wasn't born in Georgia. I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, but I came down to the South for my college. So I went to UGA. My schooling has taken
Bulldogs.
me, absolutely.
I worked for the UGA Cooperative Extension in Clayton County for years as an educator. So,
Yep. Go dogs indeed. So UGA, I was there for my undergrad, but for genetic counseling school, which is a master's program, it took me up the other side of the East Coast, up to Boston. So I
Ah,
completed my master's degree at Brandeis University up outside of Boston, and then worked in Boston for a couple of years, kind of finding my feet as an early genetic counselor.
mhm.
And I worked mostly in the pregnancy or prenatal genetic testing space. Before coming back down to Georgia, I enjoyed it so much, I wanted to make it my more permanent home. And here I am now practicing mostly in cancer, but also in prenatal. So I have really enjoyed all my time on the East Coast. Very glad to be, especially at this point, avoiding the winters. So
Oh, yes, indeed. I couldn't. If I met someone and they lived up north, we're not gonna be compatible because they don't want to come south. I'm not moving.
yeah, let me tell you, I don't miss the cold.
No, I can't do it.
All right. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a little bit about me. I enjoy, the outdoors. I enjoy cooking and especially eating food and
Oh,
especially
yeah.
new things I haven't had before.
And so, what's your favorite thing to cook or to eat?
Ooh. I mean, I'm a little bit Italian, so probably pasta is my favorite food, and I'm biased because, of course, it's a little bit easy. But my partner and his side of the family are all Filipino, so I make it kind of a project for me to learn more Filipino foods. And
Right,
his family is very gracious in helping me along with that journey. So that's been really fun for me. Always, I think, again, trying new things and
right.
that.
So red sauce, white sauce.
Ooh, red sauce for me.
I'm
But
sure
they're all good. You
most
can't go wrong.
I'm sure most Italians would say red sauce, right? Because they
Probably.
grew up with red sauce. Do you think
Yep,
more prevalent than white sauce?
I think so. I mean, and you get an occasional pesto too if you're really fancy, but
Yeah, yeah. I
I don't know
love
about that.
pesto. Yes, yes, yes. I love pesto sauce.
Yeah.
So that is pretty cool. So your bio said you've been an educator for many years. So tell us about the journey. I know you said you did
Yeah.
your undergrad at UGA here in Georgia. What prompted you to look into this master's program in this particular area? What was your undergrad degree?
Yeah. So my undergrad degree actually started in basic biology. I thought that I wanted to, I did not know about genetic counseling when I started college. Let me say it like that. I did not even know it was a field. I hadn't heard of it. But I knew I liked science and I wanted to do something with it. I thought that, oh, maybe, I could turn this into something where I would do, research in the lab and move
Mhm.
our knowledge for science forward. But as I actually started trying to do that at UGA, they got me involved in research really early, just like I liked. And I found out that I really didn't enjoy it. I
Okay.
needed a lot more personal interaction. I'm a chatty person, as you will come to know.
Yes.
And so I needed a lot more of that personal action. And I wanted to see, how the things that I was doing was actively helping people. I wanted to be in more of an active role that way. And so I didn't know for a little bit. I kind of dabbled in a few different things. I thought about becoming, a teacher or professor directly, and I did some of that even, into my undergrad and graduate, being, a teaching assistant or helping with groups or teaching
Mhm.
medical students when I got into graduate school. But I found genetic counseling really just by looking around at things to do with a general biology degree, and found that it kind of takes this aspect of understanding science, which I was passionate about just personally, and then along with teaching, right, helping explain how this is relevant to people's lives, and then counseling. And counseling to me was really what made me feel like this was the right place for me,
Mhm.
because genetic information can be really heavy, right? We're talking about things like cancer that have affected, many people's lives, and in prenatal space as well. These can be really emotionally charged conversations and results.
Yes.
So being able to provide helpful information, helping people understand why it matters to them, and
Mhm.
then be able to support them through that just sounded like the perfect thing for me. And so as soon as I heard about it, I thought this is a good fit, and I really tried to go for it right away. So once I got into genetic counseling in graduate school and then shortly beyond, the first thing I wanted to do was kind of give back. And I feel like the best way to do that is in this education. I had never heard of this career before, shortly before I joined it. And it's really common for my career of genetic counseling for this to be like a second career, right? Where people have been doing something else, heard about this because it's more of an up and coming profession, and
Right.
transferred in. And so I feel like by spreading information, not only about genetic counseling, but also about how this testing is really helpful, it's kind of giving back to both the profession that has done a lot for me, but also hopefully giving back to the people who can benefit from this.
Absolutely.
Not only the people who have heard about it so far.
That's awesome. We just ended October, which has been Breast Cancer Month,
Yeah.
and my birthday month, my
Oh,
birth month.
happy birthday.
Thank you. And so I always include breast cancer somehow. We have lost to breast cancer. So when the opportunity for me to consider this testing, I was definitely open, right?
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
I can understand when you said you knew that it was a good fit because you could educate people.
Right.
Yeah. And so you did a great job, sharing with me prior to the testing, making me feel very comfortable about the testing, and
Right.
then going over the results with me of my test as well. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, what has been like, in addition to the educational part, the most
Mhm.
rewarding aspect of this journey?
Yeah, that's a big
Exciting.
question, but a really good one. I have to say, it's the relationships I make with the people along the way. And a
Mhm.
lot of times these are people who first I see as patients, but then I'm able to help them and their family. We talked about the testing we did for you to look to see if there was genes or mutations that cause risks. And I'm glad that we didn't find anything of concern for you. But in some families, when I do find a mutation, we find the answer for why that family is having cancer. I then get to be kind of a part of that family's journey into finding the
Mhm.
next step, because not only am I doing testing for the first person I saw, but their siblings, their children, their aunts and uncles. And we
Mhm.
can get this information for the whole family. And, in that, be able to arm people or empower people with how to take care of their health, how to
Mhm.
help their doctors understand what they need, which can
Mhm.
sometimes be a difficult process
Oh
when
my goodness.
doctors as well are not always specialists in genetics. And so, it can be an educational process for really everybody in the journey.
Mhm.
So it
Mhm.
makes me feel great to know that I have made a difference, and to have these relationships again with families and with people that for which this has made a real difference. And, I hope down the way, it's actively helping them prevent cancer, or at least be able to deal with it in, a much more proactive way.
Yes, yes, yes. And so, before we kind of talk about my process, let's kind
Yeah.
of continue sharing the genetic testing process and why is it
Yeah.
important. So I know you may have something you want to share on the screen. Feel free to do that.
Yes.
I'd like for you to, just kind of, I shared a little bit, but I would love for you to really break
Yeah.
it
you know Getting into my passion of educating, I think that it's really important anytime we talk about genetics and genetic information or DNA to go back to explaining, what exactly that is. For most people, it's been a long time since we really thought about that,
down.
like maybe biology class or high school.
Right.
So what I pulled up is just to give some basic information about what is genetic information, right? What are we talking about? And I always say this in my sessions as well, right? We know our body is made up of millions and millions, trillions of pieces called cells. And inside
Mhm.
each cell is our genetic information. It's right in the middle. Our genetic information, or our DNA, comes in these packages that we call chromosomes. And we usually have 46 chromosomes that come in 23 pairs, one copy of each pair coming from each of our biological parents. Now, when we think about that, the important thing to remember is that because we have two copies of every chromosome, we also have two copies of every gene in the body. So those chromosomes are folded up very small, but we have over 20,000 genes, and then two copies of everything. And then when we talk about each gene, it's this piece of DNA that does something for the body.
Mhm.
Altogether, our genetic information is kind of like uh, kind of like an instruction book for our body, right? Telling them how to make different things, how to overall grow and function normally. But
Mhm.
each gene is responsible for making something or providing some sort of contribution, whether that's to make a protein that we use for our muscles or an enzyme to help break down food. All of these are active and important to the way that the body works.
Mhm.
When we think about, well, what does this have to do with, how do we do genetic testing? Do we just look for everything? I wish we could. Unfortunately, we don't have a full answer. It's important to remember that genetics, even though it's a well-established science, is still on the relatively new side as science goes, and we're still learning as we are moving forward. But there is a lot we can look at now.
Mhm.
When we think about things for cancer, the genes that we're looking for are genes that, when they're working correctly in the body, help to prevent cancer in some ways or another. So, for example, some genes make proteins that help repair DNA when the body makes mistakes. Other genes keep cells from growing out of control by making an enzyme or a protein that helps stop the cell cycle. So,
Mhm.
there's lots of different ways that the genes in our body are actively protecting us when it comes to things like risks for cancer. The other kind of thing that we think about, less for cancer, but in other areas of genetics, are there genes where if a person has one broken copy, they develop a genetic condition, or two broken copies? A lot of times I use the example of things like sickle cell disease. A person can
Mhm.
be a carrier
Mhm.
of sickle cell disease, having one broken copy, and not have any symptoms or have mild symptoms. But that could mean that they have the chance of having a child with that genetic condition. So
Mhm.
that kind of moves into the prenatal testing. But we think about this genetic information in lots of different ways. And looking into those genes, testing for specific conditions that we might be worried about based on the family's history,
Mhm.
is really the basics, or the core principles of genetic testing.
And that's what I did because I was really concerned about both sisters with breast cancer and a niece with breast cancer. I was like, I really need to look a little further,
Right.
to see the risk factors that I may be challenged with or presented with, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm glad that it was available to me through Kaiser, my
Yeah.
health insurance. My niece, who her sister and her mother are breast cancer survivors, is here. That's the one who
Mm.
said this is good information. So I'm glad she's watching,
Good.
so that she can share this information with her family, right?
Glad you're here.
Yes. So I'm glad that you broke that down,
Yeah.
um, because you're right. In science class when we were younger, we didn't appreciate that, right?
Right. Or how it might be important for us later. It's so
Today,
hard to
right?
keep all of this information, and there's really no need to. That's why I'm here to help.
Right. And I'm glad that you are. And so, with that being said, has this type of testing saved any lives that you or family members that you have worked with?
Right. Absolutely, yes. And that's part of the big benefit of genetic testing. An example we often talk about for things like breast cancer is some of the genes that we've known about for a while, things like
Mhm.
BRCA1 or BRCA2. You may also hear
Mhm.
about them as BRCA1 or BRCA2.
Mhm.
Angelina
Mhm.
Jolie has one of these gene mutations.
Mhm.
These are common that we can see them in families. And sometimes people don't know about it, right? Because, well, we know there's a family history of breast cancer, but maybe nobody's done genetic testing. Maybe no doctor has even mentioned that's available.
Mhm.
And so then when a person gets testing, maybe they find out they're in their 40s and they say, okay, I now know I have this gene change. I know I have an increased risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And maybe we increase the frequency of their breast cancer screening. Once they're done having kids, perhaps we remove the ovaries. I have had multiple occasions where I've talked to families where people say, okay, I want to do preventative surgeries, right? Whether it's removing the breast or the ovaries, but particularly the ovaries. We've had a lot of times when people have gone through that surgery and found that they already had an early stage cancer. This is especially the case for cancers that can be difficult to detect, like ovarian cancer. A lot of
Mhm.
times we don't see symptoms for that until much later on. And so those are especially the areas that genetic testing can make a big difference.
And you mentioned Angelina Jolie. She had both breasts removed, right?
That's correct. So this is, a type of preventative surgery. It's not
Hmm.
right for everybody, but it is
Right.
certainly an option that can be available.
Hmm.
The gene change, the specific mutation that Angelina Jolie has, she would have had about an 80% chance to have breast cancer during her life. So,
Hmm.
that's an incredibly high risk. And she said, I would do anything that I could to reduce that. And so by
Right.
removing both breasts, it takes that chance, right down to like about an average chance. And you can still have things like reconstruction if breasts are important to you.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. Again, surgery isn't always the right answer for everybody. Not everybody's Angelina Jolie.
Right.
Um, and so, the other thing that we have is even if people don't do surgical options, there's better screening we can do too. Things like, this is a little bit different. We've been mostly talking about breast cancer, but there are genes that have risks for things like colon cancer. And while nobody wants to get a colonoscopy any more than they have to, colonoscopies actively prevent colon cancer by removing things like polyps before they grow into a cancer. So if we're
Right.
doing more frequent colonoscopies for people who have a risk for cancer, we're actively lowering their risk for colon cancer every time we do one.
Absolutely.
So there's things like that aren't necessarily surgery, but can still reduce your risks.
Yes. Prostate checks,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And one of the things, I think about the black race, my race,
Mhm.
in terms of health and disparity and
Yeah,
maybe just
absolutely.
lack of interest or what have you. Because I lost a brother last year to prostate cancer surgery, and I oftentimes think
Mhm.
about what if he knew it sooner, or what if he had taken a different route, or just so many scenarios
Yeah.
about it. Lupus, all of that.
Yeah.
Um, would he
I
still be here?
Yeah, it's so hard to say, and
Right.
I think it's very normal, of course, to wonder about that when we've
Mhm.
lost a loved one.
Mhm.
I really want to mention what you said about like, how does race impact medicine? And for
Mhm.
genetics, that's often a common question, right? We think of our genetic information as something that helps determine our skin color, our hair color. Obviously our genes are passed to us from our parents. So what
Mhm.
kind of influence does that have?
Mhm.
And it does have some influence sometimes. And we know that some from genetic testing, sometimes there's particular gene mutations that are common in some ethnic groups or, more or less common in some than others.
Mhm.
But we also know that just from types of cancer itself, the way that cancer looks in the body. Like you said, for example, black men are more likely to get prostate cancer
Mhm.
than any other race of men. And we don't know for sure why. Prostate cancer is common overall, but we know it's more common for black men. And so that just means that we need to pay more attention and take better care.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's also important to say that uh, part of the onus of making sure that people know about this testing is certainly on medicine. We haven't always been the best at including everybody in care, especially in genetics and early
Right.
science research. And
Right.
it's really important for us to take accountability for that
Yes.
to move forward. Uh,
Yes, and include all races, right?
Absolutely.
Because you
Absolutely.
definitely can't get a holistic look if you're only doing one or two races, and
Exactly. We really need
everybody,
everybody.
you need everybody in the game. Um, One of the things that I want to encourage Black men to do is to have those prostate cancer checks. There's this
Right.
thing about someone testing them through their rectum and
Right.
those kinds of things, right? So I want to just encourage our Black men to go and be tested, and encourage your buddies to go and be
Yeah.
tested, right? And your
And
family members.
yes, there is a blood test that you can do first as well that tells us if we even need to go for the physical check
Mhm.
route.
Mhm.
And so if that feels really intimidating to you, hey, get that blood test and it'll tell
Mhm.
us if we even need to worry about it. And that's
Absolutely.
oftentimes feels much more routine and can be easier. But
Mhm.
if you ask your doctor, they'll let you know how often you need to go. Generally it's every year starting from 40 or 45. You
Mhm.
get that blood test and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned earlier about, we talked about cancers, and let's talk a little bit about the prenatal side of the house.
Yeah.
I know that's, really important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So prenatal genetic counseling, or excuse me, prenatal genetic testing is kind of in two different pieces. And I always talk about this because there's genetic testing for the parents, and then there's genetic testing for an ongoing pregnancy. And that's a little different.
Mhm.
You know, when we talk about genetic testing for parents, this is testing that can actually be done when you're still planning a pregnancy, not always, not even necessarily during a pregnancy. It can really be done anytime. Because this is also, we talk about blood work a lot for genetic testing, blood tests that can look to see if a person is a carrier for a genetic condition. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned for diseases like sickle cell, or also things you might have heard of like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell being a blood disorder, cystic fibrosis, a lung disorder. These are conditions where a person can have one mutation, have one broken copy of this gene and never know it, right? They can have no symptoms. And we don't test for those things for a person's health because they don't change your health. But the reason we would care if there is one broken copy of a gene is that in the same way that a person would inherit that broken copy from their parent, they could pass it on. And so we can do this testing to find out, okay, are you a carrier for any genetic conditions? And that's particularly important if both partners in a couple are carriers of the same genetic condition. So if both partners are carriers for cystic fibrosis, there's a 1 in 4 chance they both pass on that broken copy. A child has 2 broken copies and then has that serious genetic condition. So this is actually an opportunity to prevent health problems in future children. That's the way that this carrier screening can be important in people's lives, because if we find out about it ahead of time, one, we can just be prepared. Not everybody has to do something important with that information aside from just knowing. Knowledge can be really powerful in and of itself. And then the second thing is sometimes this provides new options for how to build a family. People could choose to go with things like adoption or go with fertility treatments like IVF that may allow us to select a healthy embryo that's not going to have that serious genetic condition. So sometimes this opens lots of doors, and other times it just helps people be prepared for what to expect from their child. So that's testing for the parents, which I think is, the earliest testing that most of us would be offered if you're going, to a gynecologist or going to your regular doctor and talking about, hey, I might get pregnant soon. This would be a time to talk about carrier screening. And usually this testing starts with women, but men get this testing too. And so it's appropriate for anybody. And it is recommended. Some of it is recommended for everybody. So usually this kind of thing is also covered by insurance, although every insurance is different. The other type of testing that I think we think about more often for pregnancy is testing during the pregnancy to find out information about whether the pregnancy itself has a genetic condition. And this is usually for testing for chromosome problems like Down syndrome. Going back to the chromosome picture I said earlier, right? Usually we have 46, 23 pairs. But if there's an extra copy or a missing copy of one of those chromosomes, it can cause extra health problems and learning issues like we think of for Down syndrome. So there are non-invasive tests that are available in pregnancy to look for the chance of a chromosome problem. And these are things like a non-invasive prenatal test, also called cell-free DNA, where it's a blood test, where just by taking the blood, since mom's blood moves through the placenta, we can get little pieces of genetic information from the placenta. So testing the pregnancy. Now, these are not definitive results, but they're very reliable for conditions like Down syndrome and other serious genetic conditions. And some people find this information, once again, really helpful to find out, do they want to do extra testing during the pregnancy, things like a definitive test that could have risks to the pregnancy, or do they want to test baby after birth? And some people find this information helpful to prepare, even if they never plan to do extra testing.
And when you were just talking about planning to get pregnant,
right?
Planned Parenthood, and I was thinking back years ago when people would do blood tests, right?
Right.
To see if there was a concern, and then we moved away from that, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure why. What I will say is part of it, I think, kind of goes back to a little bit of race in medicine. Some of this carrier screening has to do with a person's ethnicity or race, right? White or European individuals are more likely to be carriers for cystic fibrosis. Black people are more likely to be carriers for sickle cell. And then Jewish individuals are more likely to be carriers for certain metabolic diseases. And so I think previously it was more common for us to do these testing based on background. But we know that's not really very helpful anymore. A person can be a carrier of any genetic condition, no matter their background. Or, people have mixed backgrounds or don't always know their background entirely. And so we're moving away from that kind of race or ethnicity-based testing, but the way we should be moving towards is this testing that's available for everybody. And I don't think we've quite made that connection as much.
Yeah, because, when you think about the benefit of knowing your disposition, right?
Right.
Before you connect and have children with someone, you may decide, I'm not willing to take that risk to put that child in that situation, right?
Right.
And I think that, we should be thinking about that.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of times people find it really helpful one way or the other, whether it's to plan and make different choices. I've talked to families that find out, oh my gosh, they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a really serious genetic condition,
Mhm.
and then they go forward planning their family a different way. Whether that's adoption or using donor sperm or egg. It can be lots of different available options, and sometimes that feels much safer and still fulfilling for people.
Right.
Biologically, it's not the only way to have a family. And then on the flip side of things, sometimes even if it doesn't change anything, people feel very empowered by that knowledge, knowing what to expect, perhaps seeking out doctors in the area that are specialists for that condition, or talking to other families that have dealt with the same kind of challenges. And that can also help people build a community around, whatever they may need to be dealing with for their children in the future.
Mm-hmm. Because when we do give birth to a child with disabilities, it does put a strain on the family, right?
Yes.
Financially, physically, emotionally, because, we
Right.
may see the child suffering. I remember as a teen, I was a candy striper, right?
Yeah.
And I worked in the children's pediatric hospital unit. And I just remember seeing those children with cancer diagnoses and how courageous they were, but the challenges that it presented to the family over the journey, right?
Right.
And of course, even now. But we don't really think about that genetic testing. How
Right.
can it benefit in more ways than one?
Yeah. And I think it's common for people to think, well, people in my family are healthy. This isn't a risk for me. But it's very common. We think that everybody is a carrier of a few different genetic conditions.
Mhm.
And most of the time we don't know because it wouldn't cause us issues until, one of these rare situations comes up. So I think that's a really normal way to think, but sometimes it kind of keeps us from understanding how it could be helpful for us.
Mhm.
And again, it's a personal choice. We're never going to make anybody do any
No.
genetic testing, and that's very important, but it's just to find out, these are options that are there.
Mhm. And I was just thinking about, lupus is something that's very relevant in my family on my mom's side. And so I've always talked to my children about knowing that, being conscious of your SAID rate, making sure that, you tell the doctor so that they can check it periodically to
Mhm.
see if something's going on so that you can, address it before it gets chronic, I guess,
Right. Yeah.
um, or take different steps to prevent it, because I've seen the takedown,
Yeah.
in the family from it. And so my SET rate is always high, but I've never had a diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
And I know that from talking with a Black female doctor who has suffered from um, autoimmune disease.
Mhm.
She said a lot of times you won't catch the testing unless you're in a crisis, when you're seeking,
Care.
the care, right? And so I haven't gotten to the doctor in the right time. Not saying that I want to be diagnosed with it, but I
Yeah.
want to know,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense.
Yeah. And so I just, this is important to me. I just want to emphasize that Life with Shenita is about life, not Shenita's life, but life in general.
Yeah.
And I try to make sure people understand that. So that's why this topic is important. Genetic testing for all forms of cancer is
Mhm.
available to people. How should they seek to have it done? Like,
Yeah.
if
So that's a great question. And I want to comment about kind of two different things that you mentioned
Mhm,
there about, there is genetic testing for a lot of different types of cancer. For example, the kinds of panels or groups of genetic conditions we can
mhm,
look at are, 84 different conditions, 100 different conditions. And these are all gene changes that may lead to risks for cancer. This is on the cancer genetic side of things. You know, we know it doesn't have the answer for every single family. And that's important to remember because there are still lots of times when cancer can happen not because of a genetic problem. But it's a good idea if you have a family history of somebody with cancer, especially if that cancer happens young, like under age 50, if it's a rare kind of cancer, or if multiple people in your family have had the same kind of cancer. It's good to ask your doctor, hey, I have a family history of cancer.
Mhm.
I'm interested in genetic testing.
Mhm.
Now more than ever, there are available genetic services. So whether that's from a genetic counselor like me, a geneticist, or a doctor that specializes in genetics, or sometimes nurses and oncologists, like teams like that, may also be able to order genetic counseling or genetic testing for you.
Mhm.
The most important thing really is to ask, because many primary care doctors, they may know, yes, the family history is very important to determine, when you need to start your PSA blood test for prostate cancer or your mammograms, but they might not know when genetic testing is appropriate. And so that's why, it's better to ask for a specialist.
Mhm.
Um, there are national guidelines, and these are from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. And these are national guidelines for all of the US that most genetic testing groups and most insurances rely on to say, hey, is genetic testing recommended for this person? Is it likely to find something of concern? As well as, should insurance pay for it? I understand that genetic testing can be really scary for cost as well. And I wish I could provide, personalized explanations for everything. But that piece is often helped by these national guidelines. If your family meets guidelines, it's a lot more likely you're going to get insurance coverage for things like testing. And the best way to find that out is to have some sort of personalized conversation about your family.
Mhm. Mhm. That's good. And I listed this link here that you shared, find genetic
Yes.
counselors.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're interested in identifying someone in their area, or like you said, find out what coverage you may have
Yeah.
with your medical insurance.
And that website goes to a national website. So this is for the National Society of Genetic Counselors. So whether you're in Georgia, whether you're somewhere else, whether you're moving, or you want to tell your family or friend who maybe could benefit from this, you can give them that information, that findageneticcounselor.nsgc.org, and they can go and find somebody close to them, and that usually helps start the process. If that's not the
Mhm.
genetic counselor who works with your insurance, usually they can find you somebody who can.
Mhm. And I want to go back and reiterate,
Mhm.
we know that nothing is 100%, right?
Right.
And so, but it can definitely add some value to knowing what
Right.
you may be up against.
Yeah. You know, and another thing that I often talk about is, well, what if test results come back normal? Does that help? And maybe Shenita, I'll bring this back to you a little
Yes.
bit about how it's
Yes.
helped you. But a lot of people do find normal results helpful too, relieving them of anxiety and enabling them to make a plan, even if genetics is not the reason for what's going on.
Mhm.
How did this feel for you?
Well, it was definitely a relief because with two sisters, as I mentioned earlier, one from my mom and
Right.
one from my dad, both breast cancer survivors.
Right.
And I was really concerned about myself.
Hmm.
And so going through the process, which was not dreadful because it was a blood test, right?
Yep.
And it tested all types of cancers. So do you want to kind of share that kind of process? It
Yeah.
was seamless. Like it
So
was seamless.
yeah, and it's a little bit different depending on your hospital's preference, but this testing can usually be done through a blood test or through a saliva test.
Mhm.
So sometimes these are things that your doctor can order a kit sent to your home if you're not really close to your nearest
Mhm.
hospital, something
Mhm.
like that, where we're collecting the DNA, whether it's blood or saliva, and we usually get results back for all of those 84 genes in about 2 or 3 weeks. So this can be a quick process, or a relatively quick process, for us to get results.
Mhm.
I think what's helpful and what could sometimes take more time is, getting in for that first appointment to have that conversation, or having that follow up. Because even when you look at a genetic test result, it can be like you're trying to read another language, right? It can be difficult to interpret the result just by yourself, which is why we say, hey, always bring that to your doctor or a genetic counselor.
Mhm.
Yeah. I noticed Tamika was mentioning that she had a genetic test and they identified that it was high risk and she was only able to have, a relatively low copay with $45. And a lot of times that's the case. When these things are covered, you may have a small copay or sometimes no copay for things like genetic testing and get this, for some people, priceless information.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah. So Tamika, thanks so much for sharing that.
Yes, and her mom succumbed to cancer,
Mm,
and she's a cousin of mine in
yeah.
Florida. So I'm glad she had that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, yeah, and so hopefully people who know her will follow suit, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because somebody has to be um, the leader of the pack.
Right.
It's
Absolutely.
in the message. So I'm grateful. I had the conversation with my doctor and connected me to you, and we had the conversation and so forth.
Yeah.
I remember the first thing you said to me was ask your sisters if they are willing or had ever had the test or were willing to have the test.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that your comment about leading the pack is really relevant because, it's easy to see other people talk about it, but it's so much more meaningful coming from someone you care about or someone who knows you and what you've been
Mhm,
through, right?
mhm,
And so, I love to be able to spread the word, but a lot of times when I talk to people who, this is going to be important for their family, I say, you're the best person to help with this.
mhm,
I want to give you all the resources you need. I'm going to give you all the knowledge, arm you with all of that to go and for you to talk to your family, because a lot of times, when I'm speaking to people, they're the experts of what this is going to mean for their family. I can
mhm,
give them some guidance, but you know they're the experts of kind of who's going to want to know this information, who might be able to get testing or not,
mhm,
and be able to spread that word in whatever way would be most helpful for that individual family.
mhm. And Tamika said she suffered with colon cancer and wanted
Yeah,
to know for herself as well as for her children and her grandchildren.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah,
Mhm,
and testing for one person can help generations of individuals. When we think of things like a negative test, even when that doesn't tell us the answer for why a person has cancer, it does tell us they don't have any gene mutations, so they can't pass on any mutations if they
mhm,
don't have
mhm,
any to start with.
mhm,
So
mhm,
that can actually tell us, okay, if I don't have genetic mutations, my children won't have them, and their children won't have them either.
mhm,
And so it can tell us a lot about our health, how to plan for our children's health and cancer screening, and what we need to do or what we don't need to do in the future for them.
And I know you and I kind of talked a little bit about me not having any mutations, right?
Right.
And so with my children, I wouldn't pass it down, but then they also have to check on their father's side,
That's right.
right?
We're getting genetic information from both parents. So, if I talk to you and your family and I give you negative or normal genetic testing, that's one half of your children's genetic information. So it is always important to think about the other side of the family.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not to be forgotten.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, this is a really, I think, important conversation. That's why I wanted to have you on. I know we wanted to um, have you a long time ago, but the timing was perfect to have you on for the
Yes.
first
Thank you.
show in November.
Yeah.
Um, and so we kind of talked a little bit um, about why you would want to know your status because it will help you with healthcare decisions, not only for yourself but for family members.
Right.
How will it affect the rest of my family because they
Right.
will know my status, their potential status, or risk factors,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is
And there is something else that I wanted to talk about, which is about the element of, when we're doing this testing, what
mhm,
about things like privacy? You know, this is something that I wanted to bring up because I think it's something that's very important for genetic testing. That, how is my information being kept private by the lab or by my healthcare company? And how does this affect other things other than just my medical care, right? And there's a couple of things to mention about that. Most of the companies that you are doing this testing for, if you're going through a medical provider, right? A doctor is ordering this testing for you, a nurse is ordering the testing. If you're going through a medical provider, then they're going to be using a clinical lab, which means that those labs have special privacy requirements. They can't sell your information. They can't share your private information outside of the lab. and they can't do any research without your consent. And those are all really important things to think about how how this information is being used. I see Tamika mentioning something about things like Ancestry and 23andMe. Those are also companies that provide some genetic testing, but it's not the same kind of test as a test you would get through your doctor. 23andMe looks at some genes, but it's not a thorough test. If you get a 23andMe health report, it'll tell you about 3 possible mutations in the BRCA1 gene. But if you do a test, through a clinical genetic testing lab, it'll tell you about all possible mutations. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different possible mutations in that gene. So it's a much more thorough test when you go through a company. And also, a company that is a health-related company has those safety requirements. 23andMe is legally allowed to sell your information in aggregate, and that's the way that they make money. It's part of their consent process, and unfortunately is true. But health companies that do clinical genetic testing are not able to sell your information. They're not able to do research on your samples. And so that's an important element of privacy. Mm-hmm. If you have a test result from 23andMe and you have questions, did this actually look at my risks for breast cancer? Did this actually look at something else going on? It's also appropriate to bring that to your doctor. They'll tell you, is there anything here I'm worried about? Or, oh, I'm so glad you had, testing for these 3 things. Now let's think about something else. What else? Is there anything else we need to look at, even if you've had normal testing from there? As a genetic counselor, I think about 23andMe as certainly a way where a lot of people can get this information or some information and find out how genetic information can be helpful for them. But it's not a complete answer for a lot of the questions we have about our health.
And, I was just thinking back to the illustration you had earlier about the cell, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was listening to this doctor, a video not long ago, and he was talking about a healthy cell is so important to a healthy body.
Right.
Where it all begins in the cell.
It really does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I want to mention one other thing. I apologize. I'm taking it back a little bit to that element of things like privacy. The other thing that a lot of times people ask me about is, if I get a mutation, am I going to lose my health insurance, right? Am I going to lose my chance to get life insurance, something like that? I know this is a serious topic and not something we always talk about with doctors, but I think it's often important.
Yes.
And this is something that legally has been thought about for a while. Back in 2008, there was actually a federal law passed about this that said there's a Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It's also called GINA, if you look it up. And that provides some protection. So it says your job should never ask you about genetic testing, and they can't fire you for having a mutation. The only exception to that is the military. The military is allowed to ask you to have genetic testing because of their requirements for active duty. Mm-hmm. So genetic testing can be different for people who are in the military. In the area of health insurance, if you don't have any cancer, if you don't have any symptoms of one of these genetic conditions, then you cannot lose your health insurance because of having a mutation. They can't raise the cost of your health insurance if you have a mutation. And if you change insurances in the future, it cannot count as a pre-existing condition. The mutation itself is there to be helpful for your coverage and not harmful. So that's the protections that are provided by this federal law. And it was a bipartisan passed law back in 2008 when we first really started getting into the human genome and how we can use this information for people's health.
That's good.
Yes, it's absolutely very important to talk about. And there are some limitations. So groups like life insurance, disability insurance, long-term care insurance, those groups are allowed to ask you about genetic testing and decide, what to determine for your premiums or whether or not to cover you. But those groups also ask for things like family history. So if you have a family history of cancer, this may not change kind of your coverage from before. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it can be protective if you have a normal result that may make you more insurable than if you have a family history of cancer and never had testing. The other thing to think about here is that when you get genetic testing, that testing only impacts things you do in the future with those companies. So if you already have, all the policies you could ever want and you're not planning on changing them, genetic testing, even if it finds something, is not going to make any difference to these previously existing policies. So a little bit of logistics and privacy and how this information is used.
Yeah. And, wrote my book, Is Your House in Order, which
Mhm.
is behind me, for many reasons, not just for me, but to help be a guide to others. But when we think about insurance, health, I immediately think about um, long term health care, right? Or health insurance. And I share this a lot. I had a girlfriend, and she's still living, um, who has MS.
Mm.
She was very young. I think she might have been in her 30s when her mentor suggested to her to get a long term policy
Yeah,
before she was diagnosed. And shortly after that, she was diagnosed with MS, which definitely affected her ability to work.
right. Yeah.
But the policy that she had gotten, she was had a great income, and it was covered at that
Good.
great income,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, that's amazing.
I like to share this with people because I want us to start thinking about things differently. And so, because she had that policy and she no longer is able to work, her policy pays as if she's working that full time job, right?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Her quality of the standard of living never
Yeah.
changed because someone advised her, very young age, I need you to think about this. And she took the advice and she got it.
I think that's an amazing story. A lot of times I tell people if they're coming to see me, think about this. Genetic testing, it's your DNA, it's always going to be there. It's going to be around and available, and it's only getting cheaper and more information over time. So get what you need to get in order and then come back to me and we can make sure you get the information you need. But take care of yourself first and, make sure that you are able to take care of yourself for a long time. That's what we're trying to do.
That's it. That's it. So I'm
Mhm.
so glad we're having this conversation because
Yeah.
definitely a passion for me. Um, I know we put the link up for them to look up genetic counselors. Um, do you want to just go over why they should see a genetic counselor and how they should choose one?
Yes, great.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll kind of go back to the two different areas of genetic testing that I've discussed, although, there's many unique subspecialties within genetic counseling. So if you think, oh, maybe this could apply to something else, it likely can. But I'm going to talk about the areas that are my specialty. For pre-pregnancy, like family planning, as well as during a pregnancy. If you are planning to get pregnant anytime in the next year or two, you can't even plan farther out, but in the next year or two especially, that's a great time to see a genetic counselor to ask for carrier screening. And that will give you the options to do lots of things with those results. And you can ask for that from an OB-GYN if you're seeing a regular OB-GYN, or from your primary care doctor. So men, you can also ask for this testing. And so that would be the first time to ask for prenatal or preconception genetic testing.
Mhm.
So carrier screening is what you would be asking for. For during pregnancy, genetic testing is usually routinely discussed at the first or second visit in a pregnancy. Well, they'll talk about options, both for the chromosome testing and for carrier screening if you haven't done it before. That's usually brought up, but if you don't remember hearing about it, ask your doctor, what genetic testing can I do for this pregnancy? Sometimes they can order it for you directly, other times they'll have you speak to a genetic specialist. When it comes to cancer, the biggest thing to think about is there a family history of cancer? We're getting close to a time when if there's any family history, it may be good to have that kind of conversation because there's a lot of different things that can qualify a person for genetic testing or qualify someone in the family. Also, if anybody has had cancer themselves, it might be good to come and take a look. I know Tamika said before that she had had a colon cancer. Not all cancers are caused by genetic problems, but if you've had a personal history, that's certainly enough for us to talk about whether it would be helpful. So if you've had a personal history of cancer, if you've had a family member with cancer, especially if that family member was under age 50 when they were diagnosed, if they had a rare cancer like triple negative breast cancer, ovarian or pancreatic cancer, or another type of rare cancer, as well as if multiple people in the family have the same kind of cancer or cancers that can travel together. So we think of breast, prostate, and ovarian cancer kind of traveling together for colon cancer, other related cancers can be things like uterine, other stomach or GI cancers, or ovarian cancer as well. So even if there's, a few cancers that you think maybe these could be related, better to come in and talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Tamika's comment there, knowing can assist you in making a decision on what types of insurance you'll need. And it's a good idea to buy into a cancer policy.
Yes.
And there are many out there that are available too. So that's a great suggestion there. Is there anything that you would like to share about um, upcoming
Yeah.
events or links? I know at the bottom we have scrolling your LinkedIn page, the
Right.
National Society of Genetic Counselors, which is, of course, there.
Yeah, so a day that's coming up actually is a Genetic Counseling Awareness Day, which is the second Thursday in November every year. We have the Awareness Day, not an appreciation day like you might see for other people, because we're still making sure that people know about us.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this a little bit, of course, for me as a genetic counselor in this relatively small field, but I also think that, our job as counselors is to advocate for our patients, right? And to be here for more people and try to make sure that everybody's brought into the fold when it comes to things like genetic testing. So if you think, wow, this sounds great, I'd really like to see someone, or I'd really like to learn more about this and become a genetic counselor. We need all sorts of perspectives, all sorts of people in our field. And we want to be able to help everybody. So I would say, if you hear about genetic counseling or tell your friends and family about genetic testing, that's really the best thing you could do for me. There are some activities going on for Genetic Counseling Awareness Day, so you're welcome to go ahead and look that up. It's with the National Society of Genetic Counselors as well, or the NSGC. And that will give you a little bit more information about kind of what all we do and how genetic testing can hopefully work for you.
That's awesome. I believe caring is sharing, and knowledge is powerful when it's applied. And so I wanted to share this because I think it's definitely important. Um, and I want people to have conversations, right? I want them to have conversations that could make a difference, could be a game changer, could save a life, could save a future generation.
Yeah.
Have the conversation. It's just like me talking about, is your house in order before you die or get sick? We all know that we're going to die.
It's going to happen one day.
One day. We just don't know when, right? So we need to have the important conversations about the impact of your loss that it will have on people who are relying on you for whatever reason. And so I am willing to be the voice as it relates to getting your affairs in order in all those areas, because I just want people to be comfortable having these conversations about health, about death, about money, about sex, about marriage, relationship, all those things that people are shy about. Let's talk about it.
It's better to talk about it. If you sweep it under the rug, it's not going to make it's not going to do anything good for anybody, I guess. It's my perspective.
At all. So I just want to thank you so very much for taking time to share this very important conversation with my audience. And thank you for the work that you're doing to make a difference in the lives of people.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me. I am glad to be able to share this information. I hope that, even if it makes a person think about something new that they hadn't before, even if you ultimately don't do any testing, I still consider that a win, just because I'm, hopefully able to bring this information to somebody who hasn't heard it before. Even if you want to talk to one person about it, that would make me so happy. And I'm glad that I can be helpful, in this way.
Yes. And will you share the Awareness Day again, the website again,
Sure.
which is next week, right?
That's right. So the second Thursday in November is the National Genetic Counseling Awareness Day. And to look into it, you can go to nsgc.org. That's National Society of Genetic Counselors, nsgc.org.
Yes, awesome. Any parting words of wisdom?
I think that's about it. But, thank you everybody for your time. I hope that everyone is able to live long, healthy, and happy lives. And I hope this helps us all get there.
Yes. So, to the audience, I concur with Julie that we will live long, healthy lives full of joy. Thank you again for watching. Please tune in next Thursday for a conversation about mental health. I'm super excited to have that conversation as we are moving into the holidays. We want to make sure that we are really mentally healthy. And if we're not, that we are doing what's necessary to get into a good place. And I am excited to bring all types of relative topics to this platform. And so, again, thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, I love you, but God loves you most. He loves you best. Remember that Shenita, Life with Shenita, started to help people overcome life's challenges because we know that we all will face them at some point in on our journey. So I am grateful to be able to be a part of some healthiness on your journey. So thank you so much, Tamika, for your comments. Thank you for sharing. Everyone else, thank you for watching. Please like and share the broadcast because this is definitely important information. Thank you. And you guys have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And Julie, hold tight for me.
Great. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.